Part 1. The Bitter Cold of Fate. It was the winter of 1862, and the land around Fort Blackwood seemed to have been swallowed whole by the unforgiving Montana wilderness. The wind screamed through the plains, an endless howl that sent snow spiraling across the vast emptiness. The fort stood alone, a beacon of survival in a place where life clung to the edges of existence, 100 miles from the nearest semblance of civilization. Eliza Morgan was the last person anyone would expect to see at the gates of this isolated outpost. 7 months pregnant, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a meager satchel of belongings, she was abandoned, left to face the harshest winter known to the frontier. But fate had other plans. She arrived just as dusk was settling over the snowy landscape, her body aching from the long, painful journey. Every step she took seemed to sink deeper into the snow, the cold gnawing at her bones. She had nothing left to give, and yet the journey had taken her this far. As she stumbled toward the fort's eastern gate, her vision blurred, and her legs gave way beneath her. The last thing she saw before collapsing was the towering walls of the fort. She had made it barely. The sentry on duty, Private Miller, spotted her just in time. At first he thought it was a trick of the fading light, but when the figure drew closer, he saw the unmistakable form of a woman, her body heavy with pregnancy. "Lieutenant Taylor," Miller called, his voice urgent as he leaned out from his post. "There's a woman coming in. She's in the family way." By the time Lieutenant Taylor arrived, Eliza had already collapsed against the gate, her lips tinged blue from the cold, her face pale as the snow that surrounded her. The fort's doctor, William Hayes, was quickly summoned. "Get her inside now," he barked, his voice sharp with authority, "before hypothermia sets in. We don't have time to waste." Eliza's body was carried into the infirmary, where the warmth of the hearth slowly began to revive her. Dr. Hayes removed her frozen outer garments, his eyes immediately catching the glint of a simple gold band on her finger. "She's married," he murmured, his gaze shifting to Lieutenant Taylor. "Where's her husband?" No one had an answer. It was hours before Eliza regained consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, green like the vast plains in spring, and for a moment she was disoriented, unsure of where she was. Her fingers instinctively reached for her swollen belly. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice weak. "Fort Blackwood," Dr. Hayes replied gently. "You're safe now." Her mind was slow to grasp the situation, but when she spoke again, it was with a haunted look in her eyes. "James, he's dead. Killed by raiders 2 weeks ago." Her hand trembled as she touched her belly. "We were heading west to Oregon. We were with a wagon train. After he died, they said I would slow them down. Told me to stay behind. But the trading post, there was no room. They told me to come here. Fort Blackwood." Her words hung in the air, heavy with grief. The weight of her loss was clear, and it made Lieutenant Taylor's heart sink. The fort wasn't meant for civilians, let alone women, but here she was, a desperate woman with nowhere else to go. "I won't be a burden," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her bones. "I can cook, clean, mend. I'll earn my keep. Just until spring, when I can leave." Dr. Hayes exchanged a glance with Taylor. They both knew the reality. There was no place for her, and yet something in her plea made them both hesitate. "We'll need to discuss it," Taylor said finally, his voice resigned. "In the meantime, you can stay in the infirmary." Eliza gave a nod of thanks, though her heart sank at the thought of staying in a place so barren, surrounded by strangers who had no obligation to help her. As they stepped outside, Dr. Hayes pulled Taylor aside, his voice low. "She can't stay here forever. and with the winter barely beginning, it's far too dangerous for her to travel. I know, Taylor sighed, running a hand through his hair. But what choice do we have? The barracks are no place for a woman in her condition, and the officers' quarters are full. What about Reynolds? Dr. Hayes asked, the suggestion hanging in the air. Reynolds, Taylor scoffed. The scout. He barely tolerates the company of other men, let alone a pregnant widow. And his cabin is the last place I'd send her. He'll never agree to it. But Dr. Hayes, who had known Reynolds longer than anyone at the fort, wasn't so sure. He's not as heartless as he seems. You might be surprised. Reynolds was a man who had built his life outside the fort's walls, a man who had seen too much of the wilderness and too many battles to believe in the comforts of civilization. He had no interest in the company of others, but he was a man of duty, a man who respected the balance of survival. Perhaps, just perhaps, he might make an exception. But as they approached the stables where Reynolds was unsaddling his horse, it was clear he was already prepared to reject the idea. Whatever it is, the answer's no, Reynolds said, not even looking up from his work. At 42, Reynolds was a man who wore his years on his skin, a weathered face, a scar from a past fight, and eyes that seemed to see the world as it was, harsh, unforgiving, and cold. You haven't heard the request, Lieutenant Taylor said, stepping forward. I don't need to, Reynolds snapped. Your face says it's something I won't like. Dr. Hayes stepped forward. We have a pregnant woman who needs shelter. She was abandoned by her wagon train after her husband was killed. She's here now, barely alive from exposure. For a moment, Reynolds's expression softened, but only for a second before hardening again. I'm not taking her in, Reynolds said, his voice flat. But Lieutenant Taylor wouldn't let up. It's the only option. We have no other choice, Reynolds. It's either your cabin or the barracks. And if you refuse, you'll be bunking there too. Reynolds's jaw tightened. He knew what Taylor meant. As much as he hated it, he wasn't truly free to refuse orders. He wasn't officially enlisted, but he was bound to the army by contract. Fine, Reynolds muttered. 1 week. Then she's someone else's problem. And so, Eliza Morgan found herself in a place she never thought she'd be, under the reluctant care of a man who had long ago closed his heart off to anyone who might need him. Part 2. The cold shelter of a stranger. The wind howled outside the small cabin, its icy fingers scratching at the rough wooden walls. Inside, the warmth from a single hearth fire flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the cluttered room. Reynolds had done little to prepare for a guest, let alone a pregnant woman. His cabin, sparse and functional, was built for solitude, not comfort. He lived alone, and that was how he preferred it. Eliza sat on the edge of a rickety chair near the fire, her hands resting on her swollen belly, as if to protect the life growing within her. The soft crackle of the fire was the only sound in the room, save for the occasional thud of wind against the windows. Reynolds, ever the man of few words, had given her no more than a blanket and a place by the fire. He didn't offer food, though she hadn't eaten in hours, nor did he speak a word beyond the bare necessities. Eliza tried not to let the silence suffocate her. The journey to the fort, the abandonment, the loss of her husband, it had all been too much. But now here, in this cold and unwelcoming cabin, she was alone with her thoughts. The pain of James's death was still fresh in her heart, though her mind fought to numb the ache. Reynolds moved about the cabin in silence, his back turned to her as he busied himself with tasks, fixing his gear, cleaning his rifle, sharpening his knife. His movements were methodical, deliberate, as if each action was a way to shut out the world. He had no interest in talking. And yet, despite the walls he had built around himself, Eliza couldn't help but notice the weariness in his eyes, the subtle sag of his shoulders. The first few moments in the cabin were strained. She had no idea how to break the ice with a man like him, someone who wore isolation like a second skin. And yet, as the hours stretched on, she found herself needing to fill the silence, needing to hear a human voice, even if it wasn't kind. "How long have you been here?" she asked, her voice breaking the stillness like a stone tossed into a pond. Reynolds didn't turn around immediately, but his hand faltered on the rifle he was cleaning. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough, like gravel scraping across stone. "Years." Eliza waited for more, but none came. She glanced at the cabin's sparse furnishings. The worn cot, the faded blankets, the rough-hewn table piled with old maps and letters. Everything in this place spoke of a man who had no need for company, a man who had given up on softness. But her curiosity gnawed at her. "You never get lonely?" she asked, her tone soft, almost cautious. Reynolds paused, his hand stilling on the rifle. For a long time he didn't answer. Then slowly he muttered, "Loneliness is a luxury I can't afford." Eliza swallowed the bitterness that rose in her throat. She had been lonely too. But she wasn't used to being abandoned, to being left to fend for herself in the cold, with nothing but her memories and the hope of survival. She understood the kind of loneliness that cuts deep, the kind that scars a person's soul. But this man, he had carved out a life where people didn't matter. The room felt smaller as she sat there, her mind swirling with unspoken thoughts. It wasn't just the physical cold that made her shiver, but the emotional distance between them. Reynolds wasn't a man who wore his emotions on his sleeve, nor was he likely to open up to her, not in any meaningful way. She could sense that. But she couldn't afford to be prideful. She needed something, anything, that might break through the frozen walls he had built around himself. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said finally, her voice soft but resolute. "I just need a roof over my head for a few months. I won't be a burden. I can work, I can help." Reynolds didn't look at her as he finished his task. "You won't be here for months. It's too dangerous in the winter. Once the snow clears, you can leave." "I'm not going anywhere," Eliza replied, her voice firmer now. "Not yet." There was a long pause, a thick silence that hung in the air between them. Finally, Reynolds set down his rifle and turned to face her, his gaze hard, but not unkind. "You're not like the others," he said, his tone unreadable. "Most women would be asking for help, for sympathy. But you don't. You've got a fire in you, I'll give you that." Eliza's heart fluttered, though she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "I don't have much choice," she said quietly. "I've lost too much to let myself give up." Reynolds studied her for a moment longer before sighing, his broad shoulders heaving with the weight of an unseen burden. "You're right about that," he muttered. "But this is no place for someone like you. You're too soft. You're not built for the wilderness." Eliza felt a sharp sting at his words, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't going to let him see how much they hurt. "I can adapt," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not weak." Reynolds seemed to consider her words for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe you'll prove me wrong. But don't get too comfortable. This place, this life, it doesn't welcome weakness." The night fell, and the fire crackled louder in the silence that followed. Eliza curled into her blanket, the warmth of the fire doing little to soothe the coldness that had settled deep within her. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know how long she would stay here in this bitter, lonely cabin, under the reluctant care of a man who had built his life around solitude. But one thing she did know, she was not giving up. Not yet. Not ever. Part 3, struggling with the elements and each other. The days at Reynolds's cabin passed slowly, marked by the monotonous rhythm of survival in the wilderness. The winter storm raged on, unrelenting, trapping them both in the small cabin. Eliza learned quickly that she would have to keep busy if she was to avoid losing herself to the isolation that pressed in on all sides. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, she'd gather what little wood she could find and stoke the fire. When the cold wind howled outside, she would curl up by the hearth, knitting scarves or mending worn clothes, her hands moving without thought. There was always something that needed to be done. Reynolds kept to his usual routine, tending to his weapons, checking his traps, and making sure the cabin structure held strong against the snow and wind. He never offered her assistance, nor did he ever ask for hers. His stoic silence remained impenetrable, as if he were deliberately keeping his distance. Eliza, however, found herself looking for little ways to engage him. She began asking him questions about the land, about his life before the fort. She tried to chip away at the wall he'd built around himself, but he responded only with terse, guarded answers. She asked him once about his family, a topic she'd avoided for fear of crossing a line, but it only earned her a cold stare. "I don't talk about that," Reynolds had said, his jaw clenched. "Family's nothing but a chain you drag behind you." Eliza had sensed the deep hurt beneath his words, but she didn't push him any further. She understood too well the weight of loss, though hers had been different. Her husband had been taken from her violently, ripped from her life in an instant. Reynolds's grief seemed more complex, buried under layers of bitterness and unresolved pain. But she wasn't here to fix him. She was here to survive. And in some strange way, the two of them, isolated, both of them hardened by their pasts, seemed to understand one another, even if they never voiced it aloud. The tension between them was palpable, but there was something else there, something unspoken but growing. Despite his rough edges, Reynolds had begun to let down his guard just slightly. At night after their meals, he'd sit near the fire with a mug of strong coffee, his eyes lost in thought. But for a fleeting moment he would speak, rarely, but enough to make Eliza realize that under his tough exterior, there was a man who, like her, carried burdens too heavy to bear alone. One night, as the fire crackled and the wind howled louder than usual, Eliza watched him closely. She noticed the deep furrow in his brow, the way his fingers twitched nervously at his side. He looked like a man waiting for something or someone to return. But to where? "Reynolds," she said cautiously, breaking the silence. He didn't look up, but his muscles stiffened. "Yeah." She hesitated, unsure of how to approach him, but then decided to try again. "You ever miss anything, anything from before?" He glanced at her then, a flicker of something crossing his face, something between longing and regret. He set his mug down slowly and ran a hand through his dark hair. "Miss things," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. "No, I don't miss much. People leave, people die. It's easier that way." Eliza felt the sting of his words, the coldness that had seeped into them, but she pressed on. "But surely there was something you once cared about, someone." He met her gaze then, his blue eyes sharp and unreadable. "You don't understand, Eliza. There's nothing out there worth holding on to. You learn that real quick when you live out here. People come, people go. The land doesn't care. It'll take everything you have and leave you with nothing but your own breath." A sharp pang of sorrow hit her chest. "I know what that feels like." Reynolds looked at her closely now, as if weighing her words. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence hung thick, the weight of their shared grief pressing down on them. The fire crackled again, and then Reynolds muttered, "You're not like the others. Most women would have cried, begged for help, But you're different. Eliza swallowed hard. I've had to be, she said softly. I didn't get to choose what happened to me, but I'm still here, and I'll stay here until the spring. Then I'll be gone. Reynolds nodded slowly, his gaze softening just a fraction. You're not much of a talker, but I respect that. Eliza felt a flicker of something warm in her chest, something she hadn't expected to feel, an unexpected recognition. She wasn't alone in this cold world after all. Neither of them had chosen their circumstances, but they had each survived in their own way. It was a fragile connection, but it was something. As the days turned into weeks, the snow began to settle, and the temperature remained bitterly cold. Yet, despite the frost in the air, something had started to thaw between them. Eliza would wake up each morning to the sound of Reynolds stirring around the cabin. He never asked her if she was all right, but there was a subtle shift in the way he interacted with her. Sometimes he'd hand her a cup of coffee without a word. Other times, he'd offer to share his ration supplies when she didn't ask. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They didn't need to speak to understand one another. The silence between them wasn't filled with animosity anymore. It was a quiet, mutual respect, a rare thing in a world where survival often meant fighting for everything you could get. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, Eliza ventured outside, determined to stretch her legs. The cold air hit her face like a slap, but she welcomed it. The landscape around her was vast and untamed, a world far removed from everything she had ever known. As she trudged through the snow, her breath puffing out in white clouds, she felt a deep, aching sense of both loneliness and liberation. She had made it this far. She had survived. And with Reynolds, despite his stony exterior, she found herself strangely at peace, at least for the moment. But the question lingered in the back of her mind. What would happen when spring came? She didn't know, and that uncertainty was a heavy weight she carried with her. But she wasn't about to let it break her. Not yet. Part 4: A Storm of the Heart. As the days blurred into one another, the snow outside began to lose some of its bite. Though winter's grip still held tightly to the land, there were signs of change. The sun hung lower in the sky each day, and its pale warmth seemed to hint at the coming spring. Inside the cabin, however, the cold had not fully relented. Despite the heat from the fire, a chill lingered in the corners of the room, and the air between Reynolds and Eliza had taken on a quiet tension. It was a tension that neither of them could avoid, but neither of them had the courage to address. Reynolds, for his part, had become more withdrawn, if that was even possible. He had his routines, and she had hers. But now, Eliza noticed something more in his eyes, a distant longing, a faint sorrow that seemed to have deepened with the passing weeks. The subtle changes didn't escape her, but she wasn't sure how to approach him. She was no stranger to loss, but something about Reynolds's silent grief made it seem so much heavier, so much harder to bear. One afternoon, as Eliza gathered firewood in the small patch of trees behind the cabin, she caught a glimpse of Reynolds through the frosted window, standing by the hearth. His broad shoulders were hunched, his hands gripping something in his palms, though she couldn't make out what it was. His eyes were fixed on the fire, the crackling flames casting sharp shadows across his face. There was a tightness in his jaw, a clenched look of frustration. For a moment, Eliza hesitated, unsure of whether to interrupt. But curiosity got the better of her. She stepped closer to the window, her breath fogging up the glass, and watched him in silence. There was something raw in his expression, something that made her heart ache with sympathy. She had learned over the past few weeks that Reynolds wasn't just a man hardened by the elements. He wasn't just some lone wanderer who had buried his humanity in the wilderness. There was more to him, layers of pain and vulnerability that were hidden beneath his gruff demeanor. But no matter how much she wanted to reach out, no matter how much she wanted to comfort him, she didn't know how to get past the walls he had built. Later that evening, after supper, the two of them sat in silence by the fire. Reynolds was carving something, a piece of wood that looked like it might have been a horse figurine, though it was only half-formed. His hands moved with the practiced skill of a man who had spent years working with his hands, and his focus on the task was total. But Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that his mind was far away, lost in the past, in memories he couldn't escape. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she spoke up. "Reynolds," she said softly, her voice carrying across the room like a fragile thread. "What are you thinking about?" He didn't look up, but his hands paused on the carving. "Nothing," he muttered, though the words sounded hollow. "Just keeping busy." Eliza's eyes softened. "You don't have to pretend with me, you know." He let out a low, bitter laugh. "Pretend? I'm not pretending anything. I've spent enough time alone to know what's worth thinking about." His voice dropped, turning quieter, more reflective. "But sometimes the quiet gets to you. Makes you think things you don't want to think." The rawness of his admission startled Eliza, and she sat straighter in her chair. "Like what?" Reynolds didn't answer immediately. Instead, he ran his fingers along the edge of the wood, the texture beneath his fingertips almost like a lifeline. His silence seemed to stretch for a lifetime, but when he finally spoke, it was with a weight that made Eliza's breath catch in her throat. "Like how I ended up here," he said, his voice low and heavy with regret. "How I pushed everyone away. How I let things fall apart." Eliza could feel the shift in the air, the moment when the distance between them became just a little bit smaller. She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said. "Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." For a long moment, Reynolds said nothing. Then he set the half-carved figure down on the table with a small, deliberate motion. He looked at Eliza for the first time that evening, his blue eyes dark with something she couldn't quite decipher. "I didn't ask for any of this," he muttered, his voice rough. "But here I am. And here you are. It's not supposed to be this way. It's supposed to be me, alone in the cold. That's how it's always been." Eliza's heart clenched in understanding. She knew what it was like to feel like a burden, to think that being alone was somehow easier than facing the world with others. But she also knew that kind of thinking was a prison. It wasn't meant to be this way for either of them. Not like this, locked in the same cold cabin, but locked in their own emotional isolation. "Maybe it's not about what's supposed to be," she said, her voice soft yet resolute. "Maybe it's about what is." Reynolds's gaze lingered on her, and for a fleeting second, Eliza saw something else in his eyes. A crack in the fortress he had built around his heart, just enough to show the man beneath the layers of pain and pride. But it was gone in an instant, replaced with the familiar hardness that had defined him from the start. "Maybe," he murmured, standing up and walking away from the table. "But don't expect me to change. I've lived this way too long to know anything else." Eliza didn't argue. She knew he wasn't ready to let anyone in, not yet. But that didn't mean she couldn't keep trying. She couldn't give up. Not yet. Not when she had come this far. As the fire crackled between them, the silence settled once more. But now it wasn't just the cold that lingered in the room. It was the unspoken understanding that, perhaps, they were both still figuring out how to survive. Together or alone. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: neither of them could continue carrying the weight of their past forever. Part 5. The Thawing of the Heart. As the weeks trudged forward, the snow began to show signs of retreating. The bitter winds of winter lost some of their sharpness, and the sun, though still weak and fleeting, began to rise a little earlier, casting its pale light over the cabin and the land outside. Spring was still far off, but the promise of its arrival hung in the air like a whispered secret. Even Reynolds, though he tried to hide it behind his stone-cold exterior, couldn't help but feel the subtle shift in the world around him. The land was beginning to wake up, just as Eliza was. The change in Eliza was gradual, but unmistakable. The lingering pallor from weeks of cold and grief had faded from her skin, replaced with a quiet strength that she hadn't possessed when she first arrived at the cabin. She was still pregnant, still carrying the heavy weight of the life inside her, but she had grown tougher. Every day she worked with determination, preparing meals, gathering firewood, and even assisting Reynolds with repairs to the cabin. In every movement there was a purpose, a resolve to survive. And in that quiet perseverance, Reynolds couldn't help but admire her. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met. Where most people would have crumbled under the weight of isolation and the unforgiving conditions, Eliza stood tall. She had no illusions about the harshness of life on the frontier. She had seen too much to be naive. But still there was a light in her eyes, a resilience that was contagious. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight began to warm the ground outside, Eliza ventured into the woods to gather firewood. The snow had thinned considerably, leaving behind patches of muddy ground and the occasional shoot of green pushing through the earth. She relished the chance to stretch her legs after being cooped up in the cabin for so long, the crisp air filling her lungs with new life. Reynolds watched her from the window, his face softened by the warmth of the fire behind him. He couldn't help but notice the way she moved, graceful, purposeful. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to thrive. And it was strange, unsettling, to see how easily she seemed to adapt to this life. He didn't know why it bothered him, but it did. He'd grown so used to being alone, so accustomed to his own company, that having someone else, someone who brought light into the bleakness, felt foreign. Unsettling. Dangerous. But he couldn't push her away. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. She was here, and despite his efforts to keep his distance, there was a part of him that had begun to care for her. A small part. A dangerous part. As Eliza returned with her arms full of firewood, she paused at the door, catching Reynolds's gaze through the window. For a moment, the two of them just stood there, silently observing each other. The weight of unspoken words hung between them. "Isn't it time we moved on from the cold?" Eliza asked, breaking the silence with a question that lingered in the air like a challenge. "We can't keep living like this forever, can we?" Reynolds didn't answer immediately. He turned back to his work, trying to focus on the task at hand, but her words struck him harder than he cared to admit. "You're right," he said after a long pause, his voice flat. "We can't. But it's not up to you or me when it comes to surviving out here. Nature decides that." Eliza's eyes softened, and she stepped inside, setting the firewood down beside the hearth. "I'm not asking for anything fancy. Just a chance to make it through. A chance to start over." Reynolds glanced at her, his brow furrowed, though there was something softer in his gaze now. "Start over? This isn't a place to start over, Eliza. It's just surviving. That's all it is." Her lips parted as though she wanted to argue, but then she sighed, a long, weary sound. I know this isn't some dream. But what's the alternative? We both stay here, alone in this little cabin, waiting for the next storm to hit. For how long?" Reynolds turned away from her, pacing toward the window, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His jaw clenched. He knew she was right. They couldn't stay here forever, not like this. But the thought of opening up to someone again, of letting someone back into his life, filled him with a sense of dread. "We've got food, we've got shelter. What else do you want?" he asked, his voice rough, defensive. Eliza's gaze softened, and for the first time in days she smiled, gently, but with something close to warmth in her expression. "I want to know that I'm not just surviving. That I'm actually living." Reynolds froze, the words echoing in his chest like a distant drumbeat. He knew what she was asking. She wasn't just talking about physical survival. She was talking about the life they could have if they chose it. A life beyond the walls of this cabin. Beyond the grief, the loneliness, the bitterness. But Reynolds wasn't ready. He wasn't ready to let go of the walls he had so carefully built. He wasn't ready to expose his heart to the raw vulnerability that she was offering. He couldn't bear the thought of losing someone else. "Not again. I don't know if I'm capable of that," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Eliza's smile faded, but she didn't back down. "Maybe it's not about being capable. Maybe it's just about trying." The fire crackled softly between them, and for a long while neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind had died down, and the first faint traces of spring began to stir in the air. It was a new season, a season for growth, for change. But for Reynolds, change was a slow, painful process, one he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Part 6, breaking the silence. Spring crept in slowly, a quiet intruder that softened the edges of the world outside Reynolds's cabin. The snow, stubborn as it was, receded just enough to reveal patches of earth, damp and cold, but ready to be reborn. And as the days passed, the land seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final thaw. But in the cabin, the air felt stagnant. The silence that had defined the past months hung heavily between Reynolds and Eliza, a delicate tension that neither of them could ignore. It wasn't just the changing weather that unsettled Reynolds. It was the presence of Eliza, her strength, her quiet persistence, the way she had woven herself into his life without ever demanding anything in return. Every time he turned around, there she was doing the work, offering the kindness, even though he had never asked for it. He wasn't used to this. To anyone relying on him. To anyone seeing him as more than just the hardened scout who didn't need anyone. But Eliza, with her soft determination and unspoken understanding, had started to break down the walls he had built so carefully around himself. One evening, as dusk settled over the cabin, Eliza found herself staring out of the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she gazed out at the land, now shifting with the faint pulse of spring. There was a restless energy inside her, a longing for something she couldn't put into words. She had grown stronger, more self-assured in the time she'd spent here, but it wasn't enough. She didn't just want survival. She wanted to feel alive again. She heard the soft scrape of boots on the floor, and then Reynolds appeared in the doorway, his face shadowed by the dimming light. He said nothing, only watched her for a moment before stepping further into the room. The tension between them, which had been palpable for so long, hung in the air like a low hum. Eliza didn't turn to face him immediately. She kept her gaze on the land beyond, as though the world outside had more answers for her than the man standing just a few feet away. But she felt his presence, silent, heavy, yet somehow comforting. "I'm not asking for much, you know," she said, her voice low but steady. She spoke with the quiet strength that had come to define her, but there was a trace of vulnerability in her words. I want to know that there's more to this. To life than just surviving." Reynolds remained silent, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in her words. He had heard her, of course, had listened to the longing in her voice, but he wasn't sure how to respond. How could he explain to her that what she was asking for, what she was hoping for, wasn't something he could give? How could he tell her that the quiet, simple life she wanted was something he no longer believed in? "You don't understand," he finally said, his voice gruff, as though the words themselves hurt to say. "I've seen too much. I've lost too much. I've spent years alone because that's the only way to survive out here. That's how it's always been for me. And I thought it was enough. I thought being alone was enough." Eliza turned then, her green eyes meeting his with an intensity that caught him off guard. "I understand more than you think, Reynolds. I've lost too. I've lost everything I thought I could rely on. But I'm still here. And I'm not going to let the rest of my life be about just getting by." Reynolds shifted uneasily under her gaze. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed to wrestle with something inside himself. His eyes flicked to the fire, then back to her, and he shook his head as if trying to clear the thoughts swirling in his mind. "Why don't you just leave then?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "You've got the chance now. The snow's melting, the spring's coming. You don't need to stay here." Eliza stood up then, moving toward him, the determination in her posture as clear as it had ever been. "I'm not leaving. Not until I'm ready." The finality in her voice left little room for argument, and for the first time in weeks, Reynolds felt something stir inside him. Something soft, something unfamiliar. It unsettled him, made him feel exposed, like she could see through every piece of armor he'd spent his life constructing. "I didn't ask for any of this," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask for you to be here." Eliza didn't flinch at his harsh words. Instead, she stepped closer, the distance between them growing smaller. "Maybe you didn't," she said softly. "But sometimes life doesn't give us the choice. Sometimes we don't get to decide who we need." Reynolds stared at her, his heart hammering in his chest. His emotions, which he had carefully buried beneath layers of hardened resolve, began to rise to the surface. He didn't want to feel anything. He didn't want to care. But there it was, undeniable. Eliza had found a way inside, even when he tried to push her away. "I don't know how to be what you need me to be," he confessed, his voice cracking just slightly. "I don't know how to open up to anyone. I don't know how to let someone in again." Eliza's gaze softened, and for the first time she reached out to him, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. "You don't have to have all the answers, Reynolds. You don't have to know how. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm just asking for a chance." Reynolds stood still, unable to find the words to respond. He had spent so many years running from emotions, from connections, that the idea of allowing someone into his world felt like a betrayal of everything he'd fought to preserve. But standing there in the quiet warmth of the cabin, with Eliza's hand on his arm, something in him shifted. Something inside him began to crack open, just a little. Eliza smiled softly, a small, reassuring smile that made his heart ache in a way he didn't understand. "One step at a time, okay." Reynolds nodded, though he couldn't bring himself to say the words. He didn't have the answers. He didn't know what the future would hold for them. But in that moment, he realized something. He didn't need to have all the answers to know that he didn't want her to leave. Not now. Not ever. Part 7, The Uncharted Path. The days grew longer, and the pulse of spring quickened, despite the lingering cold that still clung to the land. The thaw was slow but inevitable. As the frost retreated from the earth, So too did the emotional barriers that both Reynolds and Eliza had spent so long erecting around themselves. Yet, despite the subtle changes, both were keenly aware that the storm inside them was far from over. Eliza spent the early mornings collecting what wild herbs and greens she could find. The small plants that peeked through the thawing soil became a sign of hope for her, a quiet reminder that life could return even after the harshest winters. She didn't talk much about her past anymore, not since the day she had spoken about James and the life she had once dreamed of. She wasn't ready to dwell in that grief again. But there was a quiet shift in her, a growing resolve that had nothing to do with the land and everything to do with who she was becoming. She had come to accept the harshness of this life, but now there was something else taking root inside her. Something new. Reynolds watched her from the window, the same cold detachment in his gaze that he had worn for years. But even he couldn't ignore the subtle changes he saw in her, how she had started to fill the empty space of the cabin with a quiet kind of life. Her laughter had become a part of the air, the sound of her humming while she worked, a stark contrast to the silence he had known for so long. He didn't know how to handle it, how to navigate this strange sense of connection that was growing between them. He couldn't deny the attraction he felt, but he also couldn't ignore the part of him that resisted the idea of opening up to her. She didn't need him. She had made it clear that she was capable on her own. But there was still something in her eyes, a silent plea that he couldn't refuse, not any longer. One afternoon, after a long day of work, Eliza sat near the hearth, her back against the warm stone wall, her hands folded in her lap. She had been quiet for hours, lost in thought, the weight of her pregnant body pressing down on her. The silence between them had grown more comfortable over the past weeks, but it was still there, a constant companion. Reynolds, as usual, was cleaning his rifle. He had taken to doing it every day, a ritual that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. But today something was different. He set the rifle down, his movements slow, as though he was gathering the courage to say something he hadn't been able to voice. Are you still planning on leaving when the weather clears?" he asked, his voice low and steady, though it carried the weight of unspoken questions. Eliza's eyes met his, and for the first time in days, she saw something in his gaze that wasn't just the mask of the lone survivor. There was uncertainty in his eyes, a vulnerability she hadn't expected to see. "I don't know," she replied honestly, her voice soft but firm. "Maybe. But it doesn't feel like the right time yet." Reynolds studied her for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. And if it was the right time? If the weather cleared and the land was safe to travel again? Eliza didn't answer immediately. She knew what he was really asking. She could feel the hesitation in his voice, the same fear she had carried when she first arrived at the cabin, the fear of being left behind. But Eliza wasn't the same woman who had stumbled through the snow to Fort Blackwood. She had come to realize that she didn't need to be alone to survive anymore. And she didn't need to run. "I think," she began slowly, choosing her words carefully, "that it's not about the weather or the land. It's about where I am in my life. I've lost so much, Reynolds, and I've learned that surviving isn't enough. I need more than just survival." He looked at her, his jaw tightening, his face unreadable. "And what is it you need?" he asked, his voice edged with something almost desperate, though he wouldn't admit it. "I need it." Eliza paused, her fingers nervously tracing the edges of her blanket. "I need to know that there's something beyond the pain, that there's more to life than what we've been through. I need to know that it's still possible to live." Reynolds swallowed hard, his throat tightening as her words sunk in. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to tell her that he wasn't the person who could give her that. He had spent his entire life avoiding the very things she was asking for: connection, hope, warmth. They were things he had given up on long ago, and he wasn't sure he had the capacity to embrace them again. "I don't know how to give you that," Reynolds murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be what you need." Eliza stood then, her eyes locking onto his with a clarity that took him by surprise. "You don't have to know everything," she said, her voice steady. "You just have to be willing to try." For the first time, Reynolds looked at her not as the woman who had arrived on his doorstep, but as someone who had become part of his life. She had a strength that mirrored his own, quiet, unspoken, yet undeniable. He had tried so hard to shut her out, but now, standing before him, Eliza wasn't a burden. She wasn't an obstacle to his solitude. She was someone who had found a way to carve a place for herself in his world. And in that moment, Reynolds realized something he had never allowed himself to consider before. Maybe he didn't have to be alone. Maybe, for once, he could let someone in. Maybe he could allow himself to feel again. He took a tentative step toward her, his movements slow, as though unsure of what to do next. But Eliza didn't back away. She didn't need to. She was ready, even if he wasn't sure he was. "I'm not asking for much, Reynolds," she said quietly, her voice tender yet firm. "I'm just asking for a chance. To not be alone. To find something worth living for again." Reynolds stood there, torn between the past that had shaped him and the future that Eliza was offering. It was a choice he hadn't expected to face, but now, standing before her, he couldn't ignore it any longer. "I'm not perfect," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "But maybe we can figure it out. Together." Eliza smiled, a soft, relieved smile that made his heart swell unexpectedly. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his, and for the first time in a long while, Reynolds allowed himself to believe that the road ahead might not be as lonely as he once thought. Part 8. The road toward tomorrow. The days that followed seemed to pass in a blur, each one carrying with it a blend of quiet moments and shared decisions. As the winter receded and the land breathed a slow, steady sigh of relief, Reynolds and Eliza found themselves caught in a delicate dance, neither truly committed to the change that had begun to shape their lives, yet both unable to fully turn away from the pull that had brought them together. Eliza's resolve grew stronger with each passing day. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't continue living in the shadows of the past. She had endured enough pain, enough heartache. She had been forced to become strong for survival, but now it was time to live. Reynolds, on the other hand, was still grappling with the layers of his past. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to return to the solitude he had so carefully cultivated. Yet despite his fear, despite the coldness that still lingered in his heart, there was a part of him that began to thaw. He found himself seeking Eliza's company more often, his nights spent in the warmth of the fire with her, talking, though never too much, and sharing the kind of silence that spoke louder than any words could. One evening, after a long day of preparing the cabin for the spring rains, Eliza found herself sitting outside, gazing up at the sky. The stars had begun to emerge, small and shimmering against the dark canvas above, a quiet reminder of the vastness of the world beyond. She let out a long breath, the weight of her thoughts pressing heavily against her chest. She had been trying to ignore the nagging question that had been rising inside her, the question of what would happen when the land fully thawed. What would happen when she had to leave? Her gaze shifted toward the cabin door, where Reynolds stood, looking out into the wilderness. There was a quiet strength in him, a resilience that matched her own, yet there was also something broken about him, a part of him that couldn't fully heal, no matter how much time had passed. She knew that leaving this place would be difficult for both of them, but the thought of staying felt even harder to bear. "You're thinking too hard again." Reynolds's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to find him approaching her, his usual guarded expression softened by the shadows of evening. "Stop wearing that frown out here in the cold. It doesn't suit you." She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Just trying to figure things out." "You ever do that?" Reynolds lowered himself onto the log beside her, his boots crunching against the ground. "I used to. Too much thinking, not enough doing." He sighed, the sound heavy with years of regret. "But that's not a luxury I have anymore." Eliza met his gaze, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm not sure I'm ready to leave." "Not yet. But when I do, I don't want it to feel like I'm running away." Reynolds studied her for a long moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "You've been through enough," he said, his tone softer than usual. "You don't owe anyone an explanation. You've made it this far, Eliza. You're stronger than you think." She turned her gaze back to the stars, her fingers brushing through the grass beneath her. "It's not just about strength," she whispered. "It's about what happens after. After the storm clears. After the pain fades. What's left?" Reynolds didn't answer right away. He didn't have the words for her, not the ones she wanted to hear. He wasn't sure there were any words that could offer the comfort she was searching for. But he understood the question, perhaps more than she knew. "You'll figure it out," he said after a long pause. "You're not alone in this, you know." "Not anymore." She looked at him then, her heart giving a quiet thud in her chest. There was something about the way he said it, the simplicity in his words, that made the ache in her heart feel a little lighter. Maybe it wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was enough to know that, for now, they were walking this path together. "I'm starting to think that maybe I can," she said softly, more to herself than to him. The fire in the cabin crackled loudly as the wind picked up, but for the first time in weeks, Eliza didn't feel the cold creeping into her bones. The warmth she had been searching for wasn't just from the fire or the sun. It was something else, something she couldn't name. A connection, maybe. Or the possibility of a future, even if she didn't yet know what it would look like. "Reynolds," she began slowly, turning her body toward him, "what happens when the spring comes? When we can leave this place?" He didn't turn to her immediately. His gaze remained on the horizon, but she could see the tightness in his jaw, the way he held himself back even now. It was like there was something he couldn't quite say, a truth that he wasn't sure how to speak. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low, rough. "I don't know what happens when you leave. I don't know if I'll be able to." His words faltered, and Eliza's heart clenched at the unspoken vulnerability beneath them. She knew what he meant. He wasn't sure he could let her go. She wasn't sure she could let him go either. But life, as they both knew, wasn't about clinging to what was comfortable. It was about moving forward, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain. "I'm not asking you to keep me here," she said gently, her hand brushing against his. "But when the time comes, I want us to be ready for whatever comes next." He turned to her then, his gaze steady and unflinching, and for a brief moment the walls between them disappeared. There was no need for words. They both understood what was at stake. And though neither of them knew what the future held, they were both willing to face it together. Part 9. The Breaking of the Storm. The days blurred into one another as the promise of spring began to feel less like an abstract notion and more like an impending reality. The winds were still cold, the nights still long, but the mornings grew brighter, the air warmer. There were more hours of daylight now, more warmth in the sun's touch, and for the first time in months, Eliza felt like the world around her wasn't just surviving, it was alive, just as she was beginning to feel again. Reynolds had been quieter these past few days. The slow thaw of the land seemed to mirror the slow, inevitable thaw of the walls he had built so carefully around himself. Every time Eliza caught him watching her, there was something different in his gaze. It wasn't pity or indifference. It was something deeper, something uncertain but real. She knew he was struggling with the thought of her leaving, with the thought of facing life on his own again. But there was a tenderness to him now, something she hadn't seen when she first arrived. He was still the same gruff, solitary man, but now there was a softness to his actions, an unspoken care that spoke louder than words. It wasn't easy for him, but the way he looked at her, when she laughed, when she worked, when she sat by the fire, her belly swelling with the life inside her, it was a look that made her heart beat just a little faster. He wasn't just seeing her as a burden anymore. He was seeing her as a person, someone to care for, someone to protect, maybe even someone to keep. But Eliza wasn't naive. She knew that Reynolds was still a man bound by his past. He had lived for so long with only the company of his own thoughts, his own grief, that the idea of letting someone back into his life was terrifying. She had seen the way he withdrew, the way he hesitated before letting anyone see the cracks in his hardened exterior. She knew better than to push him too hard, but she couldn't ignore the part of her that longed for him to make a decision, longed for him to choose them. The day the snow finally melted from the last of the forest floor, leaving the earth soft and pliable beneath her feet, Eliza found herself standing at the edge of the land behind the cabin. She could see the road ahead, the road that would take her far from this place, to whatever future she could create for herself and her unborn child. And yet, despite the pull of that road, there was a part of her that didn't want to leave. She couldn't shake the feeling that the life she was meant to build was here, in this small cabin, with the man who had come to mean so much to her. She didn't expect Reynolds to come outside, but when she heard the crunch of boots on the ground behind her, she turned to find him standing there, his gaze fixed on her. "Is it time?" he asked, his voice quiet, though the weight of the question hung between them like a heavy fog. Eliza took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she met his eyes. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know what the right thing is anymore." Reynolds stood there for a moment, his arms crossed, his eyes unreadable. It was clear he had something he needed to say, but the words didn't seem to come easily to him. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his gaze shifting to the ground. "I don't know if I can be the kind of man you need. The kind of man anyone needs." Eliza's heart tightened at the rawness of his words. She had heard his struggles before, the ghosts of his past, but hearing him admit his doubts shook something deep inside her. "You don't have to be perfect," she said gently, stepping toward him. "I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be here." Reynolds met her gaze then, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and longing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with all the unspoken emotions that had been building for months, the quiet understanding that had begun to define their relationship. "I can't promise you that it'll be easy," Reynolds said finally, his voice hoarse. "But I'll try. For you. For the baby." Eliza felt her heart swell at his words, the hope she had carried with her for so long suddenly blooming into something real. Something tangible. She reached for him then, her hands trembling as she touched his arm, the warmth of his skin under her fingers grounding her. "You don't have to promise me anything," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You just have to be with me. That's all." For the first time in months, Reynolds let out a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it, with her. He didn't have all the answers, but maybe that didn't matter anymore. As they stood there, side by side, with the last of the winter's chill fading into the background, Eliza realized that she had already made her choice. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. She didn't need to. Not when she had found a place here, within Reynolds's world, within his broken heart. There would be challenges ahead. There would be moments of doubt, of fear, of uncertainty. But there would also be moments of tenderness, of connection, of new beginnings. She could feel it deep inside her. This wasn't the end of the road. This was just the beginning. And as the sun sank lower behind the mountains, casting a golden light over the land, Eliza made a silent promise to herself. No matter what came next, she would face it with the strength she had learned to trust. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs to walk together. Part 10. The beginning of everything. The spring came slowly, but it came with all its promises. The air softened, the earth warmed, and the wildflowers began to push their way up from the damp soil, stubborn and vibrant. Everything was coming to life, and for Eliza and Reynolds, this new season wasn't just about the changing of the weather. It was about the changing of their hearts, the new beginnings that awaited them both. As the days passed, Eliza's belly grew heavier, her movements slower. The reality of what was to come settled over her like a gentle weight. She wasn't just carrying a child, she was carrying the future. Her future. She couldn't help but smile at the thought of that new life, of the little one who would one day run through the very fields she now wandered, laughing under the same sun that warmed her skin. Reynolds had been different since that evening by the river, different in ways that Eliza couldn't fully describe. He had softened, yes, but there was something else, a quiet resolve that she saw in the way he moved around the cabin, the way he cared for her, and the way he looked at her, as if he had finally started to understand that the love she had offered him was real and not just an illusion. Still, there were moments when the past would come rushing back to him. When the memories of his solitude, of the years he had spent alone, would threaten to pull him under. But each time Eliza was there, not pushing, not demanding, just being beside him, a steady presence in the storm that sometimes brewed inside him. One afternoon, as the warmth of the sun kissed the land, Eliza sat on the porch of the cabin, her hands resting on her belly. The soft hum of insects filled the air, and the scent of the earth, freshly alive after the long winter, surrounded her. She closed her eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over her. Reynolds came to stand beside her, his boots heavy against the wooden floorboards. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft as if afraid to disturb the stillness. Eliza nodded, smiling up at him. "I'm more than okay," she said, her voice thick with the emotion she had long held back. "I never thought I could feel like this again." Reynolds sat down beside her, his gaze never leaving her face. The weight of what had happened between them hung in the air, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like something they had both embraced, something that had finally found its place. "You've been through more than anyone should," Reynolds said quietly, his voice filled with a tenderness that surprised them both. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to help you build something worth living for." Eliza's heart swelled, and she reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "We've already started," she said softly. "And I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment they sat together, their hands intertwined, watching the world unfold before them. It was as if the land, too, had been waiting for this moment, waiting for them to find their place in it. The past wasn't something they could erase, but it didn't have to define them anymore. They had made it through the hardest of winters, and now they were on the verge of something new. As the evening light began to fade, casting long shadows over the cabin, Reynolds stood, offering Eliza his hand. She took it without hesitation, allowing him to help her to her feet. She was no longer the fragile, broken woman who had stumbled into his life all those months ago. She was stronger now, not just because of the life growing inside her, but because of the life she had built here, with him. The air was cool, the stars beginning to emerge in the sky above. It felt like a moment of quiet surrender, a recognition that they had both come far, and yet there was still so much more to live for. They had walked through their darkness, their grief, their fears, and now they stood at the edge of something beautiful. "I don't know what the future holds," Reynolds said, his voice a low murmur in the evening stillness. "But I do know this, we'll face it together." Eliza smiled, her heart full. "That's all I need." They stood there together, in the quiet night, looking at the stars, at the life that lay ahead. It wasn't about what had been lost, nor was it about the uncertain road they still had to travel. It was about what they had found in each other, the peace, the understanding, the strength to keep moving forward. And so, as the land around them bloomed with new life, so too did their hearts. The future was no longer a question. It was a promise, one they would build together.